Hello everyone, my name is Brooklin Myers and I am an Elixir Newbie. My goal is to help people adopt Elixir and grow as developers while doing the same myself. I do that by documenting and sharing my own experience in the Elixir industry. It's been an incredible journey so far and I look forward to taking the next step with you. So let's jump in to the Elixir Newbie Podcast. Finding your first programming job is hard. Finding any programming job can be hard depending on the position that you're coming from. If you want to get into Elixir for the very first time and you don't have any Elixir experience, that can be certainly more challenging than if you're coming in with existing experience. Now, a lot of companies are willing to hire developers based off of their merit in previous languages, as opposed to requiring that they have Elixir experience specifically. And the Elixir job market in particular is a good one to get into because as a developer, while there are fewer companies hiring, there are also fewer developers looking. And so it becomes a great industry to get a start in because there's less competition and there's also a significantly clearer learning path. The Elixir ecosystem, which is to say all of the tooling involved in Elixir, is significantly smaller than the JavaScript ecosystem. And so the learning path becomes significantly more clear and you can be much more focused on learning the exact Elixir tools that most jobs use, as opposed to needing to figure out, okay, well, I'm learning JavaScript. You need to learn something for databases. There's a ton of different options for that. You need to learn something for servers. There's a ton of different options for that. You know, do you learn Apollo or Meteor? Or do you learn GraphQL and REST? And there's this massive learning path and all sorts of different tools that it becomes very difficult as a junior to figure out exactly what do you need to learn. But in Elixir, I think the Elixir community has done a better job of consolidating on specific tooling. And so it's much more clear if you want to become an Elixir developer, then it's much more obvious what choices you can make to break into that. For example, if you want to become a web developer with Elixir, learn Phoenix. And Phoenix already comes with all the tools you need out of the box that will be pretty much everything you need to get started. And so regardless of what specific industry you're trying to get into when it comes to programming, if you're trying to get into Elixir or if you are trying to get into a different language, the process of doing that, while it does have some differences, the general path is more or less the same. You need to get the skills to do the job, and then you need to figure out how to find that job. And that can be broken down into some smaller actions you can take. The very first action you can take is figuring out what do you need to learn to get a job? And then figuring out, well, okay, now that you've set up this path for yourself, how do you effectively learn those things? And once you've done that and you have all of the skills, then how do you leverage those skills to find and create job opportunities? How do you find jobs? Where do you go to seek jobs? How do you network? This is basically the skill of how do you put yourself into interviews given the skills that you already have? And then once you have figured out how to create those sorts of opportunities, how do you interview well? And if you break down all of those different sub-skills of finding a job, then you can effectively get yourself into the Elixir industry. So how do you decide what you need to learn? This is one of the big pitfalls in the road to becoming a developer that I see a lot of new developers getting stuck on. They rather aimlessly pick up information. They don't have a clear grasp of what it is they need to learn to actually become employable. And you can spend a lot of time in that position. A lot of people refer to that as tutorial hell, which is this endless spiral of learning and learning and learning, but never really understanding what it is you need to know to become employable. And so how do you figure out the exact skills you need, kind of the minimal framework you need to become an Elixir developer? And fortunately, Elixir has done a very good job of having extremely good documentation and an excellent getting started guide that runs you through every core piece of syntax that you might need in order to use the language effectively. I'll put a link in the show notes to the Elixir language, elixirlang.org getting started guide. And it has steps 1 through, I think 24 or so in its getting started guide. And frankly, if you're just beginning with the language, looking at it now, I think you'd really only need to go through the first 8 or so examples in the getting started guide to know quite a bit about how the language works. It is a follow along guide, so you can install Elixir, get it running on your computer, and you can follow along with all of the exercises so that you are actively learning how to use Elixir. Once you have a grasp of the syntax in the language, you can then either move on to learning how to apply that syntax, either by doing perhaps programming challenges or building side projects, and I'll talk more later on how to pick good side projects. But another place you can step to from there is diving straight into how to do web development with Elixir, specifically learning the Phoenix framework. And the reason I recommend jumping straight into Phoenix is, one, going down the web developer path. If you don't already have experience in the industry, there is the most amount of opportunity, in my opinion, learning web development. That is a great place to start your career, either if it's your first programming job or if you're transitioning from another industry. Now, if you're transitioning, you might have some specific experience and specific interest, and you can go ahead and ignore my advice. But if you are new to the industry, then learning how to do web development is going to be one of the best ways to get your first foothold into the industry. So how do you learn Phoenix? Well, much like Elixir, Phoenix has a fantastic getting started guide that runs you through how it all works, how to add on to it, and how to build out the front end of your application, which is everything that the user sees, and build out the back end of the application, which is how do you handle the logic, how do you handle storing information, and how do you do all of everything involved in the back end of your application with Phoenix. And if you follow that getting started guide, you will have pretty much everything you need to know to get started using Phoenix very effectively. And that's only 2 resources. And if you follow them, you're going to be a very capable Elixir developer by the end of it, provided that you've absorbed the information and gone and applied it and actually and really grasped everything that it teaches. If you know what is in both of those guides, that is enough to do most junior Elixir jobs right off the bat, and then learn on the fly. But that's going to be enough to get started with. And while that will be enough to get started, that's going to give you a solid foundation as an Elixir developer. There are ways you can go above and beyond the core documentation in order to learn how to apply everything that you have to this point learned by reading the Elixir documentation and going through the Phoenix documentation. So once you have that foundation, what else do you need to learn to get a programming job? Well, one of the most efficient ways to figure out what it is that you're missing as a developer, what additional skills you need, is to go out and apply for work. Finding jobs and seeing what things you don't know, that they wanted you to know in that interview is one of the most effective ways to get very quick feedback on what it is that you're missing as a developer. Now, that's not feasible for everyone. Not everyone feels comfortable jumping right into applying for jobs, even if you're not 100% sure of your skills and experience. But if you can be comfortable with that, and if you can walk into an interview not with the goal of getting a job, but with the goal of getting feedback for future jobs and making connections with people that might lead to opportunities later on, that is a very, very fast, rapid way to figure out exactly what you need as a programmer. Now, if you're not entirely comfortable with that, or if you're just looking for an alternative method of figuring out what it is you need to learn, another really great way to figure out what skills you're missing is to look at Elixir Job Opportunities. And frankly, this applies to pretty much any industry that you might be interested in getting into, but I'm going to talk about Elixir specifically. Look at Elixir Job Opportunities, look at the online job boards, which I'll talk more about later, and see what sorts of requirements they have that they are looking for, and figure out which of those you don't already have or know about. If they talk about you must understand agile practices, then go and research agile. If they talk about having a solid understanding of what functional programming is versus object-oriented programming, then you're going to need to go and learn how to compare and contrast those two things. And rather than following some sort of programming guide, that is going to be a very targeted way to figure out the exact skills you need to actually get the job. One other way to learn beyond the core of the language is to follow some sort of guide. So I do recommend being careful how many guides and courses and tutorials that you use, as opposed to building your own projects. There's something about building your own side project that forces you to figure out, how do I leverage the tool, which is the Elixir programming language, or using the Phoenix framework? How do you leverage that tool and apply it to solve a particular problem? And the issue with most courses is that you're following along, you're being spoon-fed the answers, you're not having to really challenge yourself to research and understand the problem so that you can create a solution. And if you only do courses on sites like Udemy, then you might find that your problem-solving skills, which are, in my opinion, the most important skills as a developer, those skills might not be getting worked out, and you might not really be growing as a programmer if the only way that you're learning is by doing courses. And if you're looking for a recommendation on a good course to take, I really enjoy Stephen Grider. He's a terrific teacher, and he has a Udemy course called The Complete Elixir and Phoenix Bootcamp, which, if you're looking for something beyond the core documentation for Elixir and Phoenix, that can be a great way to have a path laid out before you of how to learn those tools beyond just those fundamentals, and how to actually apply those tools to build projects and solve common problems. And the great thing about that course is you would come out of it having some projects to put on your resume. Okay, so now that you have this learning path in front of you, you have figured out what steps you need to take to become a Elixir developer. How do you actually go and learn that? What is the most effective way to develop a practice of learning, to motivate yourself to learn, and how do you do it effectively so that you don't spend years wasting your time? And one piece of that puzzle is discipline. How do you be disciplined enough to regularly and routinely learn? And one great way is to keep yourself accountable. And how do you keep yourself accountable? Well, there's this really great challenge that you can do on Twitter called the 100 Days of Code Challenge. And the idea is that every day you post with that hashtag, 100 Days of Code, and you say what you learned. And the research behind sticking with something, as far as I'm aware of it, says that if you make yourself accountable, if people are expecting you to do that next day, then you're going to be more likely to stick with it. Another key to keeping yourself disciplined is to have a regular and achievable goal of learning. So when you're trying to form a habit, I see a lot of people going very, very hard at first and then giving up very quickly as soon as they realize that they can't maintain it. It's far better to program for 5 minutes a day for your entire life than it is to program for 5 hours a day for 1 week. So reducing your goals, and if you want a book on where I'm getting this information, I highly recommend the book Atomic Habits. I'll put that in the show notes as well. And that book has taught me a ton about how to set effective habits. And one of the biggest takeaways is make your habits very, very small so that you do them every single day, as opposed to making them so large that you're never actually going to do it. And a lot of people struggle with that because they feel like, well, 5 minutes isn't real. I'm not actually learning anything. But again, the idea is to always do 5 minutes. It's far better to succeed at 5 minutes than to fail at 5 hours. Always do 5 minutes. And then if you want to learn more and if you want to keep going with it, you've gotten into some sort of flow, then that's fantastic. Keep at it. But that goal of always learning 5 minutes as opposed to not learning that day because you weren't feeling great or you felt like there just wasn't time, keeping that goal very small so that you train yourself to always achieve it, that is a life-changing way to approach habit change. Once you have a regular practice of learning, how do you make that learning actually effective? And you can learn passively, which is you can watch videos, you can listen to tutorials, but I think most people would find it intuitive that that's not a very effective way to learn. The two most effective ways to learn that I found are learn by doing. So apply what you learn, build projects, and do programming challenges, actually code. And the other way to learn, which is shockingly effective, is teach. And you might not feel like you can teach when you're first learning programming, but the truth about teaching is that you only need to be one step ahead of whoever you're helping, whoever you're teaching. And with the internet, you have unlimited options for teaching. You can blog, one thing I do is I actually make Twitter summaries. So I make a Twitter thread with whatever I'm interested in, whether it be a podcast episode or some concept that I picked up. And if it's small enough, I'll just put it into a single tweet and post it out with the hashtag #myelixirstatus. Or if it's large enough, I'll put it into a big long Twitter thread and just really short form summarize everything that I learned. And by summarizing it, you are forcing yourself to condense down the information into small chunks, which are far easier to remember. And if what you're learning is even larger and best suited to a blog format, you do not need to go through the overhead of setting up a blog, of creating your own site, getting started with WordPress or whatever it is that you want to use. The best way that I've found to get started with a blog is to create an account on medium.com. I'm writing on Medium. I still don't use my own blog, although that's most likely down the pipeline. It is a great way to just get started with writing. There's no approval process. You can publish right away on the platform, and it already has an existing community of people who are reading, so you might be able to get feedback or start to make connections through the platform. And it shouldn't be about the making connections. It is more about writing it for the sake of yourself, writing it for the sake of learning and sharing with the community. And it's also great for your resume, having writing experience and having a blog and showing people what you've learned. It is far easier to write a blog post than it is to create a side project. And it is something you can do quite, I don't want to say quite easily, because of course, if it's your first time, it's going to be challenging, it's going to be hard, but anyone can do it, and yet very few people do. And so it's a fantastic way to separate yourself and put something on your resume that is beyond the norm. When I first got started with Elixir, I started blogging right away, blogging about everything that I was picking up, everything that I was learning. And when I eventually did get that Elixir job interview, they told me up front that one of the reasons they were interested in me was because I had that blog, because I showed that I was interested in learning, that I was interested in spreading information and talking about it. And it is a great proof for showing people what you know, what you've learned, and that you're a good communicator, not to mention that it is absolutely a fantastic way to learn. There's something very special about trying to teach because it reveals what you don't know. You might do a course, for example, and learn how to use Phoenix. You might learn how to scaffold a basic web app and maybe get a little a fake blog going where you can put in titles and content and a list of blogs will appear. But when you try to explain how to do that for other people, it reveals the parts that you skimmed over or thought you understood, but realizing, oh, if you can't explain this, then you don't really understand it as well as you thought you did. It's this really great way to uncover what you thought you knew, but it turns out you don't know it well enough to talk about it. And if you don't know it well enough to talk about it, then when you talk about it in an interview, you're probably not going to come across as someone who really understands what they're talking about. And this forces you to get to that point. And if after all of that, you still feel like you need something to get you to the next level as an Elixir developer, then you might consider going to a coding bootcamp. A coding bootcamp is really focused on getting you the exact skills you need to be employable. And often you can learn as part of a community, which is another fantastic opportunity to teach. You can be connected with potential employers, so it does some of the networking part of getting a job for you. They also lay out a learning path. It's the route that I took after self-teaching only took me so far. And once you know the skills, in hindsight, you certainly could have learned everything on your own. But when you're new, it is still difficult to figure out exactly what you need to learn. And it's certainly difficult doing the networking side of things. So if you're looking for that last thing that is going to help you become an employable developer, then going to a bootcamp might be a very good option for you. So now you're employable. You have created this learning path for yourself and you followed that learning path. And now you feel like you have the skills you need to be employable. If you were handed a job today, you could leverage your existing skill set and learn on the fly in order to do the job effectively. So the next step is finding that job. And the first step of that journey is figuring out, how do you provide proof of your skills? You can be an incredibly seasoned developer, a very experienced developer, but if you don't have any proof that you have those skills, then it's going to be very difficult to find work. And one of the best ways of both learning and filling out your resume and filling out your portfolio is to build side projects. And how do you decide what side projects you build? Well, you may have side projects that you build as part of a tutorial, and those can be effective for a resume, particularly if you twist the side project slightly so that it isn't very clearly a tutorial project and you actually had to go outside of the tutorial in order to do some specific things. So, for example, let's say you do a tutorial on how to build a journaling app with Elixir and Phoenix. Maybe you make that more specific to something you're interested in. So for me, the perfect side project has a good overlap of interest, which is how interested are you in the project? Is it related to some sort of hobby that you have? Are you going to be motivated to actually get it done because it's something that you find inherently interesting? Or is it something that you dread? You know, do you dread building another blogging app or doing a to-do list? If you're not interested in it and it's a terrible experience, then your heart's not going to be in it and it's going to be much harder to learn. The next overlapping thing is marketability. If you do the project, is it going to be interesting to a potential employer? Is it going to be something with maybe some wow factor, something that when people look at, they go, oh, wow, that's really cool. That's a standout portfolio piece. It's also important that you feel like you're going to learn something from the project. You can pick projects that specifically involve the skill that you're hoping to learn so that it's a targeted way to apply those skills and pick them up, as opposed to doing something that leverages your existing skills. And sometimes it's a balance of finding something that teaches you, but that doesn't stretch your skills so far so that you can still get it done and have that portfolio piece. And often you might pick projects specifically because you can do them quickly and they'll go in your portfolio, or you might pick something specifically because you want to learn from it and you'll never put it on your portfolio. It was purely something that you wanted to do because you would learn from it. And the last bit of overlap is, how big of a project is it? Is it something that you could finish in a weekend, or is it going to take you a year? The truth is that a project that took you 2 hours takes up the same amount of space on your resume as a project that took you 2 months. And so picking a project that is not so large that it's going to be very difficult to ever finish, and you're going to get stuck in this loop of constantly needing to make it better and better and better and never really finishing with it, then that is going to slow you down a lot on your path to becoming a developer. A great way to both learn how to collaborate with a team of developers before you have an actual job and have a deadline for yourself so that you have some sort of portfolio piece within the context of a day or a weekend is to do hackathons. And hackathons are a fantastic event where groups of developers or people in tech or people with related skills, sometimes they'll involve beyond developers and have people like designers and even business types who focus on the marketability of the project idea, the business plan for this pretend hackathon project. And you can collaborate with this group of people to create a project in usually 24 hours, sometimes over a weekend, or there's probably others that are over different spans of time. But these hackathons are a fantastic way to come up with a portfolio piece, come up with a experience that you can't replicate on your own because you will be working with other developers. And it is something I wish I started doing earlier in my career. It was something I waited to do but you really don't have to. You can get started very early on. People are there to be supportive. Really, the biggest thing about hackathons is being someone who is willing to put yourself out there, to potentially organize your own team. When I did the Hack for Health hackathon a little while ago, maybe a few months ago now, I found that there were tons of people who really wanted to be on a team and tried to join teams. And I realized that just by starting my own team, there was a huge group of people who were practically begging to join and be on the project, and being willing to be the person to start something as opposed to being the person who joins something. That mentality, I think, is so applicable in so many different areas, but particularly in the context of a hackathon, starting your own group and getting people together and being willing to be a bit of a leader, which can be hard if you're new to programming. Even if you are just joining a team or finding some sort of opportunity, the developer or the organizers of the events are usually there to help you join and find a team that you can work on. So hackathons are a fantastic way to have this portfolio piece and to get some experience in a very, very condensed, short period of time. Other things you can do to get something to put on your resume and to provide proof of your skills. I already talked about how blogging and writing is a fantastic way to get started with it. If you're comfortable, you can even make YouTube videos and any sort of content creation in order to have some proof of your ability. Can be a fantastic thing to put on your resume. A lot of people recommend open source as a way to develop a portfolio as a junior. I haven't met anyone who was actually a junior developer who immediately felt comfortable contributing to open source and didn't find that to be kind of overwhelming. And, you need to know so much just to get started. You have to have a really solid understanding of how to collaborate on a project with Git, and even just understanding what the tickets are talking about and the size of the projects out there and finding it. I have not personally found that to be an effective piece of advice for new developers hoping to get into the industry, but a lot of people do talk about it. If it is successful for you, then that's fantastic. I'd love to hear that you're having success with it, but I just haven't met anyone who's found that to be a solid experience earlier on in their career. I think that's something you get into when you have a little bit more experience under your belt. Now, for things not to put on your resume, I don't recommend that you put Udemy courses or online certificates on your resume unless they're particularly impressive. Reason being that if you put Udemy courses on your resume, that's often going to look a little bit unprofessional. It's going to look very junior, and it's going to look like you didn't have anything that you could put on there. Now, the exception to that would be if it's a high-level certificate, certification of some kind, or if it is a for example, I often put that I took the Kent C. Dodds Advanced React Developer workshop, because that is not just a small Udemy course. That was a several $100 course that a company paid for me to do with a developer who's very well known in the industry. Kent C. Dodds is a very popular and well-known React developer. So saying that I got hands-on experience with Kent that's the type of thing that I think you absolutely can put on your resume. But saying that you followed a how to build a blog app on Udemy, that is the type of thing that I think if you have other things you can put on your resume, you should probably leave out. Okay, so now you have proof of your development skills. You have created this learning path. You have learned all of the fundamental skills you need to be an Elixir developer, and you have now pieces of proof to show that you have those skills. Now that you have all of those things in place, you're ready to find job opportunities. And I have a pretty opinionated view of how to find jobs, because I think I have gone about that process in a very different way to how most people do it. And I wrote an article that I'll link in the show notes called "Are You Applying to Jobs Wrong?" And in my experience, people are primarily cold applying to jobs, which is that they find jobs online and they send out their resume and they send out some sort of cover letter or message, and they treat it as a numbers game of just applying to tons and tons and tons of positions in the hopes that eventually they find it. And that, I think, can work for some people, so I don't want to rule it out. And perhaps it should be part of your job finding experience. But in my experience, it's far more effective to find jobs through direct connections rather than cold applying. It's also a lot more fun. It is a lot more fun making friends and connecting with people and talking about programming and making developer friends who may be able to find you opportunities in the industry than it is to send out dozens of emails to faceless companies who never get back to you. And I have never found a job through cold applying. I've exclusively found jobs through connections and through people that I know. So that's what I'll speak to. I think there are people who can talk to you about how to cold apply, and maybe there's some more effective strategies for doing that, but I much prefer direct connections. So I'm going to really stress that and prioritize that as the top way to find work in the industry, especially your first job, because when you're applying to a job ad, you're competing with dozens and dozens and dozens of other developers because it's open to anyone. And so the primary filtering mechanism is how much experience do you have? And they're not able to look at things like, are you a good communicator? Are you passionate? Are you interested in programming? Are you curious? And all of those sort of soft skills, which as a new developer, that is your strength. That's what you have the ability to leverage early on because you aren't yet at a place where you can compete with experience. All of those things aren't being seen in your resume. A resume is a factual representation of what you have done. It is not a representation of who you are and how you present yourself. The only way to have that is with direct connections with people. So how do you make those types of direct connections? Well, people always call this networking, and that leaves a very sour taste in people's mouths. I don't really think of it that way. To me, networking is just making friends and talking with interesting people. For example, if you are going to a meetup, you don't want to shake everyone's hand. Oh, I guess you can't really shake hands much anymore, but if you're going to an online meetup, or maybe at the time that you're listening to this, there are in-person events again. It's more about genuinely enjoying yourself and having fun with people and talking with people about things that you find interesting than it is some sort of sleazy, salesman-y vibe of trying to market yourself. You know, no one likes transactional relationships. And if you go to a networking event, for example, I remember this networking event I went to, which was part of the school that I'd gone to. They hosted this event, and there was this one person who went around to everyone there and would introduce himself. And then the first thing out of his mouth was, "We should connect on LinkedIn." And wouldn't actually talk to anyone, wasn't having any conversations with people. And he became kind of the awkward person in the group, the person that everyone kind of felt uncomfortable around. And I'm sure he made lots of LinkedIn connections and he got lots of numbers, but no one had a good impression of him after that. And you are talking to people, you are not making connections. I mean, you're making connections in the sense that you are meeting people, making friends, but you're not getting numbers and you're not just making LinkedIn connections. You are meeting real people, having real conversations, and ideally making friends. Like, I have exclusively found work with people who I would call a friend and not some sort of job connection. And that's worked really, really well for me. So I think it can work well for you too. Go to these types of events and meet people and have a good time and talk about what you're up to. And by building this network around yourself of people who genuinely like you, then when an opportunity eventually arises, you're going to be the first person that they reach out to. And you don't need to ask necessarily, hey, I'm looking for work. Do you know of any opportunities? Or try to like squeeze it awkwardly into the conversation. Most of the time, if you just mention, yeah, I'm like job searching right now, and you kind of breeze past it, you don't make it a big thing. If people have something, they don't need you to force them to bring it up. If they're just aware that you're looking and they think it's a good opportunity, then most people, if they think you're a good fit for it, are going to bring that up and are going to say, hey, I know someone who's looking for an Elixir dev right now. Would you be interested in me connecting you to that? That might be something they're looking for. And so creating those types of direct connections, I think can be a great way to find your first job. So while you're at these networking events, how do you be the type of person that people like, that people find interesting, that when people have an opportunity, you're the person that they think of? And that is a huge question. It's the subject of an entire industry of self-help, and there's no way that I could possibly answer that question in full within a single episode, a small section of a single episode of a podcast. But suffice it to say that at the core, be a giver and not a taker. Be someone who figures out how to add value to other people, who expresses genuine interest and curiosity in other people, and wants to support other people, as opposed to figuring out how you can get value from those people for yourself. And you will not see a transactional, if you do something good now, then you receive something immediately. And that's the point of it. The point is that you don't have transactional give and take relationships. You foster a spirit of giving to other people, and then you find yourself surrounded by people who have that same spirit. And then you have this network and community around you who, when you mention, yeah, I'm looking for a job, I really want to be able to buy food next month, you have a number of people reaching out to you, making sure that you don't starve. And that is a very, very powerful thing. So create that network around you and create that group of people who can make sure that you remain employed. And in this case, that you find your first job in the Elixir industry. Now, if you are applying to companies directly, if rather than making connections and finding opportunities through your network, you're looking for a more targeted way to apply to a company, well, one way to do that is through job ads. And there are some great sites for Elixir. If you look for Elixir job ads, you'll find sites like Elixir Radar and elixirjobs.net. You can also use common sites like Indeed or LinkedIn to find those types of opportunities, and that can be part of your search. But a big part of finding work is figuring out, how do you find opportunities that other people are not looking for? You want to be one of a few select people, or ideally the only person applying to a job, as opposed to competing with a large group of other developers. And one of the ways to do that is to, again, this is direct connections, but instead of within the context of going to a meetup, or maybe you find some sort of online book club or some sort of online community, this is in the context of finding companies that work in Elixir and applying to them directly by finding people who work in the company, by emailing the people responsible for for hiring, and going through them even though they don't necessarily have a job ad posted, or if they do have a job ad posted, trying to reach out to other people in the company. And there's two big reasons to do that. One of the reasons is that you skip the queue. So you're now no longer part of a list of developers looking for the job. You're now going directly to the people responsible for highlighting, or why do I keep saying highlighting? Responsible for hiring. And you're now potentially avoiding the pre-filtering mechanism that occurs when a bunch of resumes come in. And the second reason is that now you're making connections and relationships with people within the company itself. For example, I would send out messages on LinkedIn to people who were working at a company that I was interested in, and I would chat with them. I'd ask them about how they enjoy their job. This is another way to find out, is this the type of place that you want to work? If they respond back and say, actually, I'm miserable and I hate it here, well, maybe you can skip that particular job. On the other hand, if they say, yeah, like we love it, it's absolutely fantastic, here are the things I really enjoy about it, you might even reach out and say, hey, would you be willing to do a video call just to chat about your work? And most people are very open and willing to talk to you, and you can have that conversation. And now when the person responsible for hiring is going through that list of resumes, maybe that person mentions your name, or if you happen to jump into the interview, now you have this connection within the company, which if people already like you within the company, then you are far more likely to get the job by having those types of personal connections, on top of the benefits you get by knowing that other people are working there and that they enjoy what they're doing. Once you have figured out the skill of finding and creating opportunities for yourself and getting opportunities to get in front of people responsible for hiring, to get these interviews, then there is this next skill of figuring out, how do you interview well? And practice is huge. Going into interviews and practicing and learning the stumbling points and learning, when they asked a question about this concept, I didn't know how to respond. And so practice is huge. That is, any skill you want to learn, you do have to practice. One of the biggest pieces of advice I have is, do sell yourself and do talk about yourself, with some confidence, but don't oversell yourself. Don't posture. If they ask you a question and you don't know something, it is perfectly expected and normal and fine, especially if you are a junior developer coming in for your first job, to not know the answer to something. And you might feel pressured to pretend or to come up with some sort of an answer. I've heard stories about people who either were conducting an interview and the potential candidate was clearly lying through their teeth about something that they didn't know anything about. And it's obvious to everyone if you don't know and you're talking about it as though you do know. And I've also heard stories about people who came in and felt pressured to pretend that they knew more than they did because of either they felt very stressed out walking into the interview, or truthfully, some interviewers, unfortunately, have an air of being a little bit condescending or treating an interview as an opportunity to find out what you are not good at. And they don't necessarily treat you with the amount of respect that they should. And this is incredibly unfortunate, but it is something that you're going to see. And for example, I had an interview a few months ago with a company, and it was for a job that I knew I was qualified for. I had talked with people in the company before. I had even helped them with challenges that they were facing, and knew that I was perfectly qualified coming into it. And yet in that interview, when they looked at my resume, they said, we normally don't hire people with your level of experience. And I was clearly taken aback by that. That was a comment I didn't expect to hear. And when we started getting into the technical questions, it became very clear that actually I did have the experience that they were looking for, and they somewhat changed their tune. But originally they'd looked at the resume and seen purely the number of years that I'd been developing, and they immediately assumed that I didn't have the experience for the job. And so you are unfortunately going to go into interviews that are uncomfortable, and being prepared for that is something that you can, by expecting that to be one of the possibilities, you're then more prepared if something bad does happen and if you do feel like it doesn't go well. And know that a lot of an interview feeling uncomfortable is not the fault of you. It's not your fault if you go into an interview and the interviewer chooses to make that an opportunity to be condescending or to make you feel uncomfortable. If you don't know something, you don't need to apologize for not knowing something. Like I said, that is totally normal and natural. The best response if you don't know something in an interview is just to say, hey, I've never heard of that before. I don't know what that is. And then take it as a learning opportunity and say, can you teach me about it? And so, of course, the best answer to any question is knowing the answer. So if you do know something, that's fantastic, and rely on those skills. But if you don't know something, the second best answer is to just admit that you don't know it and then express curiosity. And so to an interviewer, that shows, okay, well, they didn't know about the specific thing that I asked about, but they expressed curiosity. They are clearly interested in learning. They have the right attitude and aptitude for the job. And that is a far better answer than faking or pretending to know something that you don't. And now, learning how to be good in an interview is a massive skill. It's something that you can dedicate a lot of time to and look for targeted and specific resources for. And my personal preference has always been to get interviews where I already knew the people that I was talking to. I have found that those interviews have always been more comfortable, have always been more interesting, have always been more fun than interviews with either companies through cold applying or interviews with people that I didn't already know. In fact, for my first 2 development jobs, I had never actually been asked a technical question. At no point did anyone really need to look at my resume or prod me with specific technical skills. They already had a reasonable knowledge of how good or not good a programmer I was, and the interview was just a formal conversation to figure out if what they were offering was a good fit and if I could be a good fit within the company. It was just a conversation as opposed to a technical challenge. And so that's obviously not always going to be the case. I think that is a bit of a rarity that was my experience jumping into the industry, but this really speaks to the power of getting jobs through connections as opposed to getting jobs through job advertisements and cold applying. So that wraps up the process of how to get a job as an Elixir dev. You've learned how to create a learning path for yourself, how to go about learning using active learning and teaching, how to provide proof of your skills with side projects and hackathons, with content creation like blogging and YouTube videos, and then how to find and create job opportunities using that proof of your skill. And then once you have those job opportunities, figuring out how to interview well and how to go about the interview process coming from the perspective of someone who is new to the Elixir industry or new to programming in general. So I really hope you found this useful. I really hope this helps you find your next or first Elixir job. And if you do have any questions, I would love to hear them. You can engage with me on Twitter. I'm at Brooklin J. Myers. I'd love to hear about how the job hunt is going for you, what sorts of things you're struggling with so that maybe I can figure out how to help. And thank you so much for listening. I will catch you on the next episode.